and we'll be discussing Chapter 9, Conversational Interactions.
I'm gonna discuss on the structure of conversation.
And I'll be discussing conversational participants.
And I will end the chapter by discussing the conversational settings.
So let's get started.
Yay!
One important characteristic of conversations is how it has to be coordinated from speaker to speaker. To show coordination, here's a little dance. Hope you enjoyed that little intro. Now let's get started.
Okay, so let's begin our discussion on conversational interaction. So essentially, here's a bit of an overview of how the flow will go. So first we'll start with the structure of conversation, then we'll talk about conversational participants, then we'll talk about the conversational setting. So let's start with the basics. What is a conversation? So it's a joint activity in which two or more participants use linguistic forms and nonverbal signals to communicate interactively. So it's essentially about two people or two participants who engage in linguistic forms of communication where they communicate with each other. So it requires at least two parties. So the difference between a monologue and a dialogue is you really have to have two people who interact with each other in a conversation. So there is a shift from monologue to dialogue when you engage in conversation. So it's essentially a special form of social interaction with its own rules and dynamics. So we'll get to talk about these rules throughout the presentation. So it involves interaction. Communication is one of the basic ways we interact with other human beings and the way they interact with us. So conversation is a joint action. You can't do it alone. It's carried out by an ensemble of people. It could be two people, it could be more, but you can't go less than two people. It's acting in coordination with one another, throwing a certain statement to the other person, the person replying to you, and you replying back. So a good analogy of this would be a waltz. So you can't dance the waltz alone. You always have to have a partner. And there has to be a rhythm in the way you both dance. And we'll see throughout this presentation that conversations, although they don't have explicit rules, have to have a rhythm to them. There has to be something that governs them too. And we jointly follow the rules of conversation when we engage in a conversation. So now let's talk about the structure of conversation. So according to Charles Fillmore, who's a linguist, the language of face-to-face conversation is the basic and primary use of language, all others being best described in terms of their deviation from that base. So essentially, in terms of the types of discourses, your conversation is your basis. It's what you base other types of discourse on, and we'll get to do that now in the next part. So let's compare conversation with other types of discourses. So let's first talk about debate. So this is usually common during election season, seeing political candidates debating on different topics concerning national concerns and topics. So first, in debates, topics are specified in advance. You know whether you're talking about the recession, whether you're talking about global warming, that's set in advance. There are rules specifying who can speak at a given time and for how long. So if you can remember your debates in high school, for instance, when you were in charge of, say, rebutting the statement of the other person, you'd usually be told beforehand that you have around 2 to 3 minutes to do that. And turn taking is clarified. So the person who gives the opening statement of the debate usually talks first, and then the people who are in charge of rebuttal follow, and the people in charge of closing would talk last. And now let's go to ceremonies. So a good example of this would be graduation. So it's very formalized. I think that's obvious, even in just the way we dress. So the topic is specified in advance. So for instance, when the president addresses the student body, the topic of addressing the graduates, sending them off out from the university is already specified in advance. But however, the length of time that a speaker should speak is not specified in advance, so the president or say the chancellor can talk for as much as he or she wants. Now let's go to meetings. So it is a little less formal for sure, but there still may be some rules. So I think the rules come from having usually someone to preside over the meeting. So usually there's authority with that person, so you have to respect that person. Usually that person has the floor the most. And discussions themselves may vary. So for instance, if you have a meeting about your company, you can talk about different issues within the company and you're not limited to particular issues at a time. You do have a larger number of participants, and how much each participant contributes does vary. So some people could talk more. For instance, the CEO would probably talk more than someone who has a lesser rank within the company. And now let's go to conversations. So this type of discourse would be the least formal. I think that's obvious. Conversations can happen between friends, between family members, and the number of participants and the topic, as well as the length of time that you can actually speak within a conversation, is left undecided. There's no time limit when you have a conversation with your friend, for instance. You're just able to talk for as much as you want, and your friend is able to do that as well. So there's a relaxation of formal rules. So essentially, you can talk about any topic. There's no specific length of time you're allowed to talk for. And however, despite its being a little less formal, there are still implicit communicative conventions that we do follow. And we'll talk about that in the next slides. So here's just a bit of a summary. So we have noticed that the number of people who talk in a ceremony, in a meeting, or a conversation do vary, but in a debate it has to be 2 or more. So the topics as well in a debate and in a ceremony, they're very fixed. They're a little more formal. In a meeting, however, it's partially fixed. For instance, it could go around issues concerning the company, but in a conversation, it could vary as much as it has to. And in terms of turn order, it's also fixed in a debate and a ceremony, but in a meeting and a conversation, it does vary. And as for turn length, it varies in a ceremony, a meeting, or a conversation, but in a debate, it's fixed. So here are a few questions for reflection. So I want you to remember the last conversation you've had with a close friend or a family member. So how varied were the topics you've talked about? So this is considering how a conversation is actually the least formal, and you can really talk about any topic you want and as much topics as you want. So who talked more? How long did the conversation last? Was it engaging? If so, what made it engaging? So you can remember particular statements or the tone or the rhythm of the conversation that could have made it engaging or not. So think about that for a second. Okay, let's move on. So now let's talk about the five types of conventions related to conversations. So first, let's talk about opening conversations. So I think this is pretty obvious that usually only one person speaks at a time, or else you wouldn't really understand each other. So we have something that we call simultaneous turn. However, so even though usually only one person speaks at a time, there are times when we do overlap, that two or more perhaps speakers do overlap when carrying out conversations. However, these are very brief and do not characterize conversations as much. So these usually happen at turn exchanges. So for instance, the floor of the conversation is shifting towards another speaker. Usually there's an overlap of statements towards the end of one speaker's turn. There is individual variations in the number of turns and type of each speaker, and I think this is obvious based on our own experiences as people who have engaged in conversations. An interesting thing, however, is that research shows that the length of turn is actually a stable individual characteristic. So if you're more garrulous and tend to talk more in conversations, that tends to be constant in the conversations that you have in your life and with other people. But if you're a little more taciturn and you tend to just listen more in a conversation, that would reflect in other conversations that you'd have in the future as well. And another interesting thing is that pauses in a conversation actually match that of other participants. So the rhythm is established in a conversation based on the number of pauses that the participants have in the conversation. They essentially pattern their own pauses to that of the person they're speaking to. So that's pretty interesting. And so we open a conversation in a limited number of ways. We usually have like go-to expressions to open a conversation aside from just a simple hello. So examples would be addressing another person, requesting information. So for instance, you're lost, you'd try to ask a stranger of where to find the place you're going to. You could also offer information to another person. Or you could use stereotype expressions. So this could be like your hellos or how are you? And usually you have an expected response from that person. So essentially when you're opening a conversation, you're trying to get the listener's attention. Now let's talk about the ABAB sequence. So as I mentioned, conversations are essentially it involves turn taking. So usually people don't talk at the same time. So the ABAB sequence tells you that there's an alternation of turns that is central to conversation. So speaker A talks first, and speaker A could throw a question at speaker B, and speaker B could say something as well and throw it back to speaker A, and so on. So the sequence is essentially turn taking. So our openers can at times be so predictable actually that we can actually anticipate a conversational response from another person. So when we ask another person how they are, usually they answer us with fine if they're all right, or not so good, for instance, if they've had a bad day. So that's kind of predictable. Now let's talk about how people close conversations. So we often use a pre-closing statement. So this includes our well, so, okay. When we start saying those, it's kind of indicating that we want to close the conversation. Or it's also possible that when we try to close a conversation, the listener could bring up another topic, and so the conversation would continue. So here's a good example. So let's talk about the stereotypical garrulous and inquisitive tita, if you will, in Filipino culture. So usually in for instance, your lola's party, you are trying to close the conversation with her because she's really probing into your life. But it's really difficult to do that because she constantly brings up another topic. So say she says, "Iha, tumataba ka," and you're like, "Eh, oo nga po," and you try to go away and you try to eat, but then she brings up another topic. She's like, "Pero iha, kain ka pa, may boyfriend ka na ba? Bakit parang lumiliit ka?" And parang you always have to answer that question, and you're trying to end it, "Oo nga po, sige lang po, banyo lang po ako," but it's a little more difficult to end it. So that's just an example. And it leads you to become confused after the conversation. So there are ways by which we end a conversation, and it's important to know that it based on research, it does follow a particular sequence. So first, we usually summarize the conversation's content. So usually, it was nice talking about the school fair. It was nice catching up on what happened in our lives after 5 years, for instance. And then after that, we justify ending contact. Why we have to end the contact at that time. For instance, "Oh, I'm so sorry, I have to go, I have a meeting." So that tells the other person that you have to go and end the conversation there. You could also express pleasure at being able to talk to the person. So say, "It was so great meeting you again. It was great being able to talk again after so many years." So we express pleasure in the middle. And then we could also make reference to the ongoing relationship and planning for future contacts. To say, "Oh, I hope I see you again in the next party," for instance. You could say that. So it's essentially saying, hinting at possible future conversations that you could have with that person. And lastly, we usually wish the other well. So, "God bless, I hope you have a safe trip." And so that's usually how we close conversations, and we follow this sequence. Although at times it does vary, usually this is the flow of how we end the conversation. So we summarize first, we justify why we have to end it, we express pleasure, we make reference to a future contact perhaps, and we wish the other person well. Okay, so just a few questions for reflection. So how do you usually close conversations? What pre-closing statements do you use? Given that the length of turn is described by research as an individual characteristic, how long does your turn usually last? So just food for thought on how you are as someone who engages in a conversation. So now let's talk about taking turns. So it confuses researchers, and it has challenged linguists to think of how conversations actually run so smoothly without formal rules. So how exactly do we not bump into each other when we're engaging in conversations? So the answer is there are actually 3 implicit rules that we follow so that we're able to take turns more efficiently within conversation. So rule 1, the current speaker is allowed to select the next speaker. So for instance, when we're talking and we feel that we want to give the floor to another person, we could direct a question to another person. So like, how about you? How was your summer vacation? If you talked about your own experiences during summer. Rule 2 is self-selection. So if the first rule is not used, another person may speak up. So essentially, self-selection talks about how, like usually when there's an awkward silence, after someone stops talking in a conversation, you could just step up and speak yourself. And rule 3 is the current speaker can continue, although he or she is not obligated to do so. So it's also possible that someone else doesn't take the floor and the original speaker just continues on with his or her story or part of the dialogue. So it's important to know that rules 1, 2, and 3 are ordered rules. And rule 1 takes precedence over rule 2, and rule 2 takes precedence over rule 3. So it's arranged in that way. So for instance, if speaker A addresses a comment to B while C starts to talk, B still has the floor. Okay, so know that these rules do provide order. So these are implicit rules. Although there aren't any explicit rules in conversation, these implicit rules provide us order in conversation to make it a little less complicated. So it ensures that most of the conversation takes place with a single speaker at a time, that we're not talking over each other, or else we'd have a hard time understanding each other. And rule 2, self-selection, provides an incentive for starting quickly. So when there, as I mentioned, like dead air in the middle of the conversation, the conversation could continue on quickly if another person takes the floor after another person has finished speaking. And it's also worth noting that there is an orderly shift from speaker to speaker based on these implicit rules. Okay, so it's not just about the verbals. Non-verbals are also very important in conversation because they do happen live, face-to-face, as Charles Fillmore has mentioned. So nonverbal behavior also facilitates an orderly transition from one speaker to another. So this is where turn-yielding signals come into play. So basically, what is a turn-yielding signal? From the term itself, turn-yielding signal, it's about yielding your turn to another person. So it's essentially about displaying one or more of 6 behavioral cues that appear to indicate a willingness to conclude one's turn. So these are nonverbals that lead the other person to think that you want to conclude your turn. So first, there could be a drop of pitch. So for instance, when you want to close a conversation, you want to end your turn on talking about your experiences during enrollment. So yeah, the line was very long and I was tired, and then afterward, I just went home. So there, at home there was a drop of pitch, and that kind of indicates that the other person should start talking or sharing as well. Second, there could be a drawl on the final syllable or the final stressed syllable of a final clause. So essentially, a drawl is like how the last syllable becomes slower, so you start to pronounce the vowels and the consonants longer. So for instance, yeah, and then I went home and I just rested right after. So there, it became a little more slower. Also, you could use another turn-yielding signal would be the termination of hand gestures. So this is especially important for people who use a lot of hand gestures. When you stop to bring them up, it means that you want to end the conversation. And also, you could also use stereotyped expressions. So you could use or something, but yeah. So when you start using these, it means that you want to end your turn in the conversation. There could also be a drop in loudness, so your voice could also become a little softer. And essentially, it ends with the completion of a grammatical clause. So when you stop talking, when your last sentence is given, that indicates that you want to yield your turn to the other speakers. So here's a little formula, if you will, to keep in mind. So the number of cues indicating turn yielding is directly related to the probability that a listener would attempt to take a turn. So here, based on the study, when you use no cues, no turn yielding cues, there's only a 10%, a percentage of 10% of an attempt of the other speaker to start to speak. But when you use 3 cues, 33% of the time, the person or another speaker will attempt to speak. And when you use all 6, there's a 50% chance that another person will attempt to speak. So turn yielding signals are efficient in allowing other people or urging them to start speaking as well. So just another question, a few other questions for reflection. So which turn yielding signal do you typically use? How effective is it in urging another speaker to start talking? So reflect on this for a few seconds. Okay, so let's move on. So what if we want to continue speaking, but we're just at a loss for words, like we don't know what to say next, but we do have a topic in mind to talk about? So what happens is a phenomenon called trailing off. So it may appear ambiguous and indicate that we are finished. So we could stop talking, but at the back of our minds, we actually want to keep on talking. So what we resort to are attempt suppressing signals. And essentially, an attempt suppressing signal is the continued use of hand gestures in conjunction with one or more of the turn yielding cues. So although we show turn yielding cues, such as staying silent because you don't know what else to say, you use hand gestures to indicate that actually you want to keep on talking. So if you don't drop the hand gestures, it means that you still have the floor, or you still want to have the floor in the conversation. So based on a study, if a speaker is silent and looks away, so that means that you're giving your attention to something else and not to the other speaker. It's like you're not waiting for his or her reply. You're barely interrupted. It means probably you're just thinking of what else to say, and you're thinking on top of your head. But when a person looks at a listener and stops talking, it's a sign that the listener can start, that you're waiting for his or her reply or response. And so essentially this means that when you look away in a conversation, it means that you're not finished with your turn. So usually, to indicate that you want the other listener to start talking, you have to look at them. So remember that nonverbal behaviors are not required for successful conversation, that verbals are still more important in conversation. So in a study by Beatty, Cutler, and Pearson, students were actually asked to judge whether utterances from a TV interview came during the middle or the end of a speaker's turn. So interestingly, they were accurate based on from listening to a video and based on listening from an audio clip. They did categorize the utterances rightfully as from being in the middle of a speaker's turn or from the end. But they were unable to do that with the written transcript. So it's important from this to learn that within a conversation, or classifying statements in a conversation as being from the middle or the end is efficiently done with information based on audio and video. So there are a lot of cues For instance, the intonation and the stress and the rate that hint at whether a statement is from the middle or the end of a speaker's turn. So let's recall, based on the semester, we've talked about the categories of cohesion under discourse. For instance, reference, substitution, ellipses. So this is important in negotiating topics of conversation. It's very important to keep the cohesiveness or the cohesion of a conversation together for it to be more efficient and more free-flowing. So sometimes you use reference, we refer to something that was previously mentioned by one of the speakers or by yourself. And we also use substitution. So instead of saying a girl's name, for instance, Qristin, we substitute it with, for instance, she. And also rules of coherence in conversation. We have to keep in mind that they're actually more complex than just simple rules of cohesion that we've talked about previously in the SEM in discourse. So it's much more complex in conversations. So there are rules that govern rather than restrict our responses. So remember, a conversation is still pretty free-flowing and it's not as formal. So implicit rules govern rather than just restrict our responses. So let's have an exercise. Which of the following would be an acceptable response to "I just bought a new hat"? So 1, Fred eats hamburgers. 2, I just bought a new car. 3, there's supposed to be a recession. 4, my hat is in good shape. And 5, what color? So think about your answer for a few seconds. Okay, so let's see the answer. So 1, Fred eats hamburgers sounds a little absurd because the topic is so wholly unrelated to the statement given. 2nd, I just bought a new car is a bit odd. It sounds like you're bragging that although you bought a new hat, I was able to buy a new car, which is far more expensive. 3, there's supposed to be a recession is relevant, but it's not polite. It's saying that how dare you buy a new hat when people are having a hard time with the recession and with the economy. 4, my hat is in good shape is marginally relevant, but what color is the most reasonable response because it refers back to the original statement of the person and it allows the conversation to continue on with new information about that hat. So we should remember that in negotiating topics of conversation, topics must be faithful to the topic identified by the speaker, always. So this is to keep the cohesion or the cohesiveness of the conversation. So topics in conversation can be defined in terms of the intersection of propositions across sentences. So the propositions of the conversation have to be related to each other. So let's have this example. John bought a red car in Baltimore yesterday. So for instance, that's what speaker A says. And speaker B says, I think a red car would be ugly. So what do you think is the intersection of the propositions of these two statements by speaker A and B? So essentially, I think the best answer would be the car is red. So that's the common denominator between their two statements. Both of them mentioned that there was a red car. So that's the intersection of their propositions. That's why the statement by A and the statement by B are quite cohesive. So we should remember that only conversations, not individual sentences or even speaker turns, have topics. So the topics have to be constant within the conversation and not just within individual sentences, or else you'd lose the cohesion of your conversation. Okay, so let's have this example with the same statement by speaker A. So speaker B says, you mean he's not gonna buy my car? So think about the intersection of these two statements. So it's probably John bought a new car. They both said that there was a car. They both referred to that rather. But as you could see, speaker B does bring up a new topic that perhaps John was actually supposed to buy his car, and perhaps he could be infuriated that he didn't. So A has three options at this point to reply to speaker B. So either he or she responds to the new topic directly. For instance, no, he didn't like your car. So that's referring to the topic that he raised, that he actually has a car that John could have bought. Second, it could refer back to that part of the original topic that got a response. So for instance, well, John needed a car in a hurry. So it could refer back to the original statement by speaker A. Or third, A could make a more generalized response. For instance, it's always difficult to sell a car. So this could be changing the topic in a way or going away from the topic if, for instance, speaker B is a little infuriated. Okay, so now let's talk about conversational storytelling. So when you tell a story in conversation, it's interesting because it does break the ordinary rules of turn-taking, or it temporarily suspends them. So you do know that it's inappropriate for you to butt in when you're a listener when someone's telling a story. And it's also important that when you're telling your own story to other people, it's actually relevant to the topic that you were talking about before you actually started talking about your story. So there are layers of conversation. So let's talk about layer 1. So there are just 2 layers. So layer 1 is the primary level, or the actual people saying things. It refers to the non-fictional world, the real world involving the speaker and the listener, and vice versa in a conversation. Layer 2 involves or represents a different domain or world, which is usually tapped in storytelling. So it usually involves this fictional world. So sometimes we give comments outside of the topic, stories or jokes, so stories that could be fictional, such as stories about ogres and Harry Potter, for instance. So it's important to know that when you're in a conversation, you can make reference to these fictional worlds. But we also have to remember that although we can shift from layer to layer, that we can refer to the fictional and the non-fictional world, each layer still has to be coherent, that they still have to be connected to each other. Okay, so now let's talk about identifying participants and non-participants in a conversation. So, for instance, you're in a party, try to think of what the roles of these people are in the conversation that is happening in this party. So here you see a boy and a girl, so I call them the participants. What do you think they're doing? Or what do you think their roles are? And you see 2 speech bubbles above their heads. And then you have the side participant behind them. What do you think she does? You see her proximity, where her attention's led to. And now let's talk about the overhearer, who's quite close to them, but look at where her attention is directed to. So there are 2 types of overhearers. So first we have a bystander, so you see where his attention is directed to and how far he is from the people, from the participants on the left side. And you have your eavesdropper, so see what direction she's paying attention to. So let's define what they are. So we have the participants. So they're actually the people who engage in conversation. So it involves the speaker and the listener, and those roles shift between this boy and this girl. And then you have your side participants. So he or she, in this case she, is present during the conversation but is actually not directly involved, so she could just be listening to our 2 participants here on the left. Then you have your overhearer. It just means that that person is within earshot, so it's a party and people are really in the same vicinity essentially, so usually you're within earshot of other people engaging in conversation. Then you have your bystander, so the bystander is openly present but does not participate in the conversation. But specifically when you say a person's an eavesdropper, that person is actually listening to the participants of the conversation without their awareness. Okay, so here's just a diagram showing just what I've told you. So the speaker and the addressee are the ones engaging in conversation, and people have less engagement as you go far from that box where the speaker and addressee are. So the side participant engages less in the conversation, and more so the bystander and the eavesdropper. So as I mentioned, the engagement density becomes lower as you go far from that box. So the people who have the highest engagement would be the speaker and the addressee, and the lowest engagement, the bystander and the eavesdropper. So how exactly do you deal with overhearers? So there are 3 ways we usually deal with them. So you have disclosure, concealment, and indifference. So for disclosure, for instance, you're in a restaurant and you're this girl in the middle, the one in pink, and the person you're with, this guy on the left, dropped his fork. And the waitress on the right, although she's within the vicinity, seems to not care and seems to not replace his fork. So the guy could use what we call in Filipino as a parinig. So he could ask you, could I use one of your forks? Just to indicate to the waitress that she's not doing her job by replacing your fork. You could also use concealment. So you could use private codes or foreign language. For instance, you know the thing we talked about yesterday without explicitly saying what that was. Or you could just use indifference, not care at all that the overhearer can hear your conversation and just continue on. Hi, so I hope you learned more about the structure of conversation, about how to open a conversation, how to take turns, for instance, and how you close a conversation. And I hope this helps you in the conversations you're going to have in the future. So thanks for watching my part.